On December 18, 1994, Alison Botha was abducted near her home in South Africa. By the end of the night, she had been raped, stabbed, and disemboweled. But somehow, she managed to live. This is the story of Alison Botha and her incredible will to live. Alison Botha was born on September 22, 1967, in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Her parents divorced when she was 10 years old, and Botha spent most of her childhood living with her mother and brother. In her early years, Botha led a fairly normal life. She served as head girl at the collegiate high school for girls in Port Elizabeth. When she finished her education, she spent a few years traveling, and after she returned home, Botha found a job as an insurance broker, which she enjoyed. The night of her attack seemed like an ordinary night, at least at first. 27-year-old Alison Botha had spent most of the day soaking up the sun with friends at a beach in her hometown of Port Arthur, South Africa. When it started getting late, she invited everyone back to her flat to hang out and have a bite to eat. At the end of the evening, her guests had bid her farewell and headed home. Since it wasn't safe to walk the streets after dark, Alison had given rides to those who didn't have transportation at the ready. It would be a gracious act that would cost her dearly before the night was through. When she returned to her apartment alone just after 3 a.m., Alison was a bit put out to find that someone had taken her usual parking space in front of the building. Her choices extremely limited, she had been forced to settle on a spot that was further away than she would have liked. As she was about to get out of the car and go inside, someone opened the driver's side door. Before she had time to react, a man put the blade of a knife to her throat and told her to slide into the passenger seat and keep quiet, or he would kill her then and there. Alison did as she was told in the hopes that the menacing stranger would release her unharmed if she cooperated with his demands. As they drove off into the darkness, he told her that his name was Clinton and that he simply wanted to borrow her car. He promised that he would let her go in short order if she behaved. Having never before been in the presence of true evil, she had believed him. When the man she knew as Clinton pulled onto a side street and came to a stop, it hadn't been to set Alison free, but rather to let an even more threatening presence into the car. She would later say that when she looked in the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of the figure in the back seat, she knew that she was in trouble. While the driver had at least made the effort to fake cordiality up to that point, his partner had glowered at her as a predator would its intended prey. Instead of freeing her, Alison's abductors had taken her to a remote spot on the outskirts of the city. Once there, they had thrown her on the ground amidst piles of broken glass and scattered debris. After informing her that she was going to be raped, Clinton had asked if she planned on fighting back. Still holding on to the notion that he would make good on his promise to let her go, she had assured him that she would cooperate if it meant seeing her family again. Seemingly satisfied with her response, Clinton had proceeded to sexually assault his terrified captive in every way imaginable. When he was finished, he had turned her over to his accomplice, who had frightened her from the moment she laid eyes on him. As she braced herself for what was to come, he had proceeded to viciously rape Alison while simultaneously choking her. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, she had lost control of her bodily functions, causing her to evacuate her bowels. While this hadn't seemed fortuitous at the time, this natural reflex may very well have helped save her life. Having been arrested on rape charges in the past, the men had decided in advance that the only way to avoid jail time would be to make sure that their future victims couldn't go to the police. With this in mind, once they had their fill, they had taken turns stabbing Alison in the abdomen. By the time they were through, she had sustained 37 penetrating wounds to her midriff, causing her intestines to spill out onto the ground. As her would-be killers stood around chatting and admiring their handiwork, they had been surprised to see that the object of their brutality was still breathing. In an attempt to finish the job, Franz had knelt over her and sliced her throat 16 times with deadly precision. Despite her grave injuries, Alison had been aware of his hand moving back and forth in front of her face as he slashed her so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. Once they were certain that she was well and truly dead, the men had dropped all pretense and called each other by their proper names as they climbed into Alison's car and prepared to head back to the city. As the headlights disappeared into the night, the ravaged young woman miraculously regained consciousness. As she lay broken and discarded in the middle of nowhere, literally flayed open, Alison wrote a farewell note in the sand. After letting her mother know one last time that she loved her, she had scrawled Franz and Thunes, so that whoever found her body would know the first names of the men who were responsible for her death. Though it probably would have been easier for her to lay down and wait for the inevitable, Alison hadn't been ready to give up on life just yet. Aware that she had to get help fast or the choice to live would no longer be hers, she had pulled herself up and started walking towards the road. As she took the first step, she noticed that her line of vision was impaired to such an extent that she couldn't see what lay ahead. It was only when she put her hands to her face that she realized that her neck had been almost completely cut through, making it impossible for her to hold her head upright. Just as she was coming to terms with the severity of her injuries, she felt something wet around her ankles. Holding her head in place so that she could look down, she saw that her intestines were bunched up at her feet. Determined to make it to safety or die trying, Alison, who was completely naked and covered in blood, had to figure out a way to put her body back together before continuing. After discovering that her assailants had left her clothes behind, she had used her shirt to fashion a sling with which to carry her displaced innards. As she held the precious bundle with one hand, she used the other to hold her head in place. With her physical form more or less intact, she resumed her trek to find help. The walk to the nearest road was a long and arduous one. Since it was the middle of the night, traffic was all but non-existent. Still, Alison held out hope that an angel would find her in the darkness and lead her to the light. Against all odds, she got her wish. No longer able to carry on, Alison had collapsed in the roadway. As she lay on the pavement, her life slipping away, she saw headlights approaching in the distance. When the car reached her, the driver had slowed down long enough to take a look before speeding off without offering assistance. Moments later, she heard another vehicle coming towards her. This time, rather than passing her by, it had stopped. Her angel had found her. In a stroke of luck, a 20-year-old veterinary student from Johannesburg named Tian Eilerd had been taking the scenic route with a friend that put them in the right place at the right time. Somehow, all the stars had lined up, and they had spied Alison lying in the middle of the road. Rather than driving on as the motorist before them had done, they had felt compelled to render aid. While his friend called for an ambulance on his mobile phone, Tian had knelt down and gently maneuvered Alison's protruding trachea back in place. He had then covered her with his shirt before taking hold of her hand and reassuring her that help was on the way. When the ambulance dropped Alison off at the hospital, after a ride that had taken much longer than it should have, emergency room doctors got to work straight away on the young woman who had sustained more injuries than a body could normally withstand. Even so, believing that where there was life, there was hope, they had put everything they had into bringing their patient, who had shown a remarkable will to live, back from the brink of death. Miraculously, none of the 50-odd stab wounds had hit an artery or vital organ. As a result of the horrific injuries to her throat, a tube had been inserted into Alison's windpipe to aid in her breathing. When detectives brought a book filled with photos of potential suspects to the hospital only hours after the attack, she had picked out Franz Dutoit and Thunes Kruger as her assailants. One of the suspects, Franz Dutoit, was a 26-year-old husband and father, with a criminal history that included violent attacks on women. While he had been accused of rape on multiple occasions, he had gotten off time and again with a slap on the wrist, which may have had something to do with the fact that his father was a police officer. The other half of this dastardly duo was even more of a wild card than his partner. 19-year-old Thunes Kruger was trouble walking on two legs. As opposed to his cohort's upbringing, Thunes had grown up living hand-to-mouth in an allegedly abusive household. His father, rather than being in law enforcement, was a career criminal who had been in and out of prison throughout much of his son's childhood. Proving that birds of a feather flock together, he too had dabbled in Satanism. When Franz was interrogated by police regarding what happened to Alison, he had assumed that he was being questioned about a murder. When he was informed that his victim had survived, he had rolled over faster than a potato bug. Realizing that authorities had him dead to rights, Franz had handed over a ring caked in blood that was identified as belonging to Alison Botha. If there had been any lingering doubts as to his involvement, all such thoughts were erased in that moment. When Alison was able, she was asked to pick her attackers out of a lineup. Her case would be the first in the history of the South African legal system in which a one-way mirror was used to protect a victim from having to come face to face with their alleged assailants. Even though they had altered their appearances in an attempt to skirt justice, Alison had easily pointed out Franz and Thunes. In spite of their efforts to throw her off, their faces had been burned into her memory. The trial began on June 12, 1995. Before the day was over, one of the defense lawyers withdrew his services for ethical reasons. No one familiar with the horrific details of the case could blame him. On August 7, 1995, the court rendered its verdict, guilty on all charges. The presiding judge sentenced both Franz and Thunes to life in prison. He was so appalled by their callousness and lack of humanity that he had taken the unprecedented step of including a caveat that they never again be allowed to see the light of day.